The dark truth behind the transatlantic slave trade. What they don't tell you. The transatlantic slave trade is one of the most harrowing and transformative events in human history. Spanning over 4 centuries from the 16th to the 19th century, it was a system of mass exploitation, dehumanization, and violence that reshaped the world. While many are aware of its existence, the full extent of its brutality, systemic nature, and long-lasting consequences is often overlooked, minimized, or deliberately obscured. This essay delves into the dark truths of the transatlantic slave trade, shedding light on the aspects that are frequently omitted or understated in mainstream narratives. The transatlantic slave trade was unprecedented in its scale and cruelty. It involved the forced displacement of millions of Africans, the destruction of entire communities, and the establishment of a global economic system built on human suffering. Historians estimate that between 12 and 15 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and transported across the Atlantic Ocean. However, this number only accounts for those who survived the journey. Millions more died during capture, forced marches to the coast, or the brutal conditions of the Middle Passage. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a nightmare of unimaginable horror. Enslaved Africans were packed into ships like cargo, often lying shoulder to shoulder in filthy, cramped conditions. They were subjected to extreme heat, disease, and malnutrition. Mortality rates were staggeringly high, with some estimates suggesting that up to 20% of enslaved people died during the voyage. Those who resisted or were deemed unruly were often thrown overboard or subjected to brutal punishments. Enslaved Africans were stripped of their humanity and treated as property. They were given European names, forced to abandon their languages and cultures, and subjected to relentless violence. Whippings, mutilations, and sexual abuse were common tools of control, designed to break their spirits and ensure compliance. While the transatlantic slave trade was orchestrated by European powers, it could not have functioned without the active participation of African elites and kingdoms. This complicity is often glossed over in discussions of the trade. Role of African elites. Many African leaders and traders collaborated with European slavers, capturing and selling enslaved people in exchange for goods such as guns, textiles, and alcohol. This collaboration was driven by a combination of economic incentives, political rivalries, and the desire to acquire European weapons to strengthen their own power. Internal slave trade. Slavery existed in Africa long before the arrival of Europeans, but the transatlantic trade dramatically expanded its scale and intensity. The demand for enslaved laborers led to increased warfare and raiding within Africa, as powerful kingdoms sought to capture and sell their enemies. This internal slave trade devastated communities and destabilized entire regions. The transatlantic slave trade was not just a moral atrocity, it was also a cornerstone of the global economy. The wealth generated by enslaved labor laid the foundation for the modern capitalist system and the rise of Western dominance. Wealth built on slavery. Enslaved Africans were forced to work on plantations in the Americas, producing lucrative commodities such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. These goods generated immense profits for European nations and helped finance the Industrial Revolution. The economic benefits of slavery were felt not only in the colonies, but also in Europe, where the wealth extracted from enslaved labor fueled the growth of cities, industries, and financial institutions. Insurance and banking. The slave trade gave rise to modern financial systems. Insurance companies profited by insuring enslaved people and slave ships, while banks financed voyages and provided loans to plantation owners. Many of these institutions, including some that still exist today, owe their origins to the wealth generated by slavery. Despite the overwhelming power of their oppressors, enslaved Africans resisted their captivity in numerous ways. Their acts of defiance, both large and small, are a testament to their resilience and determination. Frequent uprisings, enslaved Africans resisted their conditions through acts of sabotage, escape, and rebellion. Revolts on slave ships were common, as were uprisings on plantations. These acts of resistance were often met with brutal reprisals, but they also demonstrated the indomitable spirit of those who refused to accept their enslavement. Notable rebellions. Some rebellions had far-reaching consequences. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, for example, was the only successful slave revolt in history. Enslaved Africans in Haiti overthrew their French oppressors and established an independent nation, inspiring fear among slaveholders and hope among the enslaved throughout the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade has left a legacy of inequality, racism, and trauma that continues to shape the world today. Its effects are felt not only in the descendants of enslaved Africans, but also in the economic and social structures of former slave-trading nations. Racism and white supremacy, the transatlantic slave trade entrenched racial hierarchies and ideologies of white supremacy. The dehumanization of Black people was used to justify slavery and has left a legacy of systemic racism that persists to this day. Racial discrimination, police brutality, and economic inequality are all rooted in the history of slavery. Economic disparities. The exploitation of enslaved labor created vast wealth for European and American elites, while impoverishing Africa and its descendants. This wealth gap persists today, with many former slave-trading nations remaining economically dominant, while African nations and Black communities around the world continue to struggle with poverty and underdevelopment. Cultural erasure. Enslaved Africans were forcibly stripped of their languages, religions, and cultural practices. Despite this, they preserved and adapted their traditions, contributing significantly to the cultures of the Americas. African influences can be seen in music, dance, cuisine, and religious practices throughout the African diaspora. Abolition and its limitations. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery itself was a significant milestone, but it was far from a complete victory. The process of abolition was slow, uneven, and often hypocritical. Delayed abolition. While the transatlantic slave trade was officially abolished in the 19th century, slavery itself persisted in many places. For example, Brazil did not abolish slavery until 1888, and forms of forced labor continued under different names such as sharecropping and convict leasing. Compensating slave owners. When slavery was abolished, many governments compensated slave owners for their loss of property, rather than providing reparations to the formerly enslaved. For example, Britain paid £20 million, equivalent to billions today, to slave owners in 1833, while the enslaved received nothing. The psychological and physical trauma inflicted on enslaved Africans has had lasting effects on their descendants. The legacy of slavery continues to manifest in systemic inequalities and intergenerational trauma. The trauma of slavery has been passed down through generations, affecting the mental and physical health of Black communities. The legacy of slavery can be seen in the higher rates of poverty, incarceration, and chronic illness among Black populations. Despite the horrors of slavery, African diaspora communities have preserved and revitalized their cultural heritage. The contributions of Black people to global art, music, literature, and cuisine are a testament to their resilience and creativity. The role of European nations and the United States in perpetuating slavery is often downplayed or sanitized in historical narratives. This erasure serves to obscure the full extent of their culpability and the ongoing impacts of slavery. The Confederacy in the U.S. is sometimes romanticized as a noble cause, ignoring its foundation on slavery. Similarly, European nations often portray themselves as benevolent abolitionists, downplaying their central role in the slave trade. Despite calls for reparations to address the lasting impacts of slavery, most former slave-trading nations have failed to take meaningful action. The refusal to acknowledge and redress the harms of slavery perpetuates the inequalities it created. The transatlantic slave trade was not just a historical event, but a foundational system that shaped the modern world. Its legacy continues to affect millions of people, and understanding its full scope is essential for addressing the inequalities and injustices that persist today. By confronting the dark truths of the transatlantic slave trade, we can begin to reckon with its enduring impacts and work toward a more just and equitable future.